The Japanese destroyer entered the night battle with a confidence born of doctrine and repetition. This was the environment it understood best: dark water, broken horizons, and the silent geometry of torpedo warfare. For decades, Imperial Japanese Navy planners had trained their crews to believe that night belonged to them. Visibility was limited, detection was uncertain, and decisive blows, they believed, came not from guns, but from long-lance torpedoes slicing invisibly through black water. The destroyer moved forward expecting chaos, maneuver, and perhaps damage. It did not expect annihilation. Somewhere in the darkness, an American ship tracked the silhouette differently. Not by eye, not by instinct, but by measurement. Fire control solutions were calculated quietly, mechanically, without ceremony. There was no dramatic exchange of broadsides, no rolling thunder across the sea. One American gun elevated, stabilized, and fired a single shell into the night. It was not a barrage. It was not meant to kill. It was routine. Seconds later, the Japanese destroyer was no longer a fighting ship. There was no towering fireball, no magazine detonation that split the hull in two. Observers saw something more disturbing: an abrupt failure of structure. The ship seemed to sag, as if its internal strength had been removed all at once. Superstructure buckled. Compartments went dark. Systems failed in rapid succession. The destroyer did not explode. It simply stopped functioning as a coherent object. Japanese officers, trained to read the surface of the sea as carefully as a map, scanned the water instinctively. They looked for torpedo wakes, the pale scars left behind by compressed air and certainty. There were none. No white lines. No converging tracks. Nothing that explained what had just happened. The sea was empty, indifferent, and silent. On board the stricken ship, survivors struggled to understand the damage around them. Bulkheads that should have contained explosions were bent outward, as if force had originated from within. Compartments that had not been hit directly were collapsed, crushed by pressures that arrived faster than alarms could sound. Fires burned in spaces where no flame had been seen moments before. Men were wounded in ways that did not match training manuals, injuries without obvious shrapnel, concussions without visible blast points. The destroyer had not been pierced and burned in the traditional sense. It had been dismantled internally. Damage control teams moved quickly, following doctrine, sealing what could be sealed. But there was no clear source to fight, no flooded compartment to isolate, no single rupture to contain. Power failed unevenly. Communications died in fragments. The ship felt less like it had been struck by a weapon, and more like it had suffered a catastrophic failure of its own body. Around it, the battle slowed. Other ships hesitated, not from orders, but from uncertainty. Night engagements were meant to be fluid, aggressive, relentless. Instead, commanders watched the dark water where a destroyer had just ceased to matter. No torpedo attack had preceded it. No prolonged gun duel had explained it. One moment, it had been part of the formation. The next, it was not. American observers were equally quiet. There was no cheer, no confirmation of a decisive hit. The firing ship logged the engagement almost casually. One shell fired. Target status unclear. They did not yet understand what they had done, only that something unexpected had occurred. The sea returned to motion, but the confidence that had entered the night did not. A destroyer, built for speed, precision, and survival in darkness, had vanished from the fight in seconds. No one could yet say why, but everyone sensed the same unease. Because in a battle defined by torpedoes and tradition, something else had intervened, something smaller, simpler, and far less understood. Japanese radio traffic crackled through the night with a tone that did not match the scale of the engagement. Reports came in fragmented, urgent, and strangely repetitive. A destroyer had been hit once, and yet the language used to describe the damage suggested something far more severe. Words normally reserved for prolonged bombardment or catastrophic collision were being applied to a single, isolated strike. Command centers listened carefully, waiting for clarification that never arrived. The technical details only deepened the confusion. Damage control officers described bulkheads that were torn apart not inward, as expected from an external impact, but outward, as though force had expanded from inside the ship. Steel plating bowed away from compartments that had not been directly struck. Rivets failed in patterns that defied established blast models. The ship's internal structure appeared to have betrayed itself. Even more troubling were the fires. Flames erupted in compartments that had shown no prior signs of heat or ignition. Fuel lines were intact. Electrical systems had not shorted in those spaces, yet men reported sudden bursts of fire behind sealed doors, as if combustion had been carried there by something unseen. Firefighting teams arrived too late, not because they were slow, but because the sequence of events made no sense. Medical crews encountered the same contradictions. Sailors arrived with concussive injuries, ruptured organs, and deep lacerations, yet without the expected shrapnel wounds. Some men had burns without clear sources of flame. Others were killed outright in compartments that appeared, at first glance, untouched. The patterns did not match training manuals or battlefield experience. These were not the wounds of a conventional shell burst. Engineers began arguing almost immediately. Some insisted that the damage could only be explained by an internal ammunition detonation, perhaps a stored charge ignited accidentally after impact. Others rejected this outright. There were no signs of a magazine explosion. No sequential blasts. No telltale fragmentation patterns. Ammunition lockers were damaged, but not destroyed in the manner expected from sympathetic detonation. The evidence contradicted every explanation offered. As reports accumulated, consensus proved impossible. Each officer focused on the fragment of evidence closest to his expertise, but none could assemble a coherent picture. Naval architecture suggested one cause. Medical data suggested another. Damage patterns suggested a third. The pieces refused to align. What should have been a straightforward after-action report instead became an argument about first principles. The psychological effect was immediate. Japanese naval doctrine relied on clarity, on knowing what weapons the enemy possessed and how they behaved. This incident offered neither. There was no confirmation of torpedoes, no indication of a new caliber, no intelligence warning of experimental weapons. Yet the destruction was undeniable. A modern destroyer had been rendered combat ineffective in seconds without the signatures planners were trained to recognize. Radio operators relayed the confusion up the chain of command. The language softened as it traveled, stripped of speculation and uncertainty. But the core problem remained. Something had struck the ship, and whatever it was, it did not behave according to established rules. Senior officers demanded explanations that junior officers could not provide. In the absence of answers, rumors filled the gap. Some whispered about hidden weaknesses in Japanese ship design. Others suspected an American technological leap that had gone unnoticed. Most said nothing at all, unwilling to speculate without evidence. Silence, too, became part of the report. By dawn, the paperwork was complete, but understanding was not. The incident was logged, categorized, and filed under familiar headings that no longer fit. Officially, it was a single-hit engagement with disproportionate results. Unofficially, it was a warning without a name. Somewhere between the diagrams and the casualty lists, a quiet realization began to form. A weapon was at work, one that left no obvious signature, no clear explanation. And until it was understood, every assumption about night combat rested on uncertain ground. On the American side of the engagement, there was no sense of triumph. The gunners who had fired into the darkness did not believe they had achieved anything decisive. Their role, as they understood it, was suppression harassment fire meant to disrupt torpedo attacks, force evasive maneuvers, and buy time. Destroyers were not supposed to vanish under gunfire alone. That was not how the war at sea had been taught. Reports from forward observers arrived cautiously. Enemy silhouettes were seen slowing, listing, or simply falling out of formation after only a handful of hits. In one case, after a single confirmed strike, the language used was uncertain, almost apologetic. Target appears to be breaking apart, one spotter noted, as if aware that such a statement challenged expectation rather than confirmed success. Fire control officers responded not with celebration, but with suspicion. They reviewed range solutions, bearing calculations, and fuse settings in silence. Instruments were recalibrated. Logs were checked against radar plots. If something extraordinary had happened, the first assumption was error, not effect. Machines, after all, were known to mislead. Physics was not. Commanders shared the same instinct. Naval experience discouraged belief in sudden miracles. Luck, they reasoned, explained more than lethality. Perhaps the shell had struck a vulnerable point. Perhaps enemy ammunition had detonated coincidentally. Perhaps the destroyer had already been damaged earlier in the fight. Each explanation preserved the larger belief that gunfire alone could not do this so quickly. What troubled them most was what had not happened. No special ammunition had been requested or issued before the engagement. There were no experimental rounds aboard, no last-minute changes to doctrine, no whispered briefings about new weapons. The shells being loaded were the same ones crews had handled for months, standard issue, unremarkable, almost dull in their familiarity. There had been no announcement, no test, no declaration of breakthrough, nothing that marked the night as different from the dozens that had come before. And yet, the results were different, not marginally, not statistically, but fundamentally. Enemy ships were not merely suppressed, they were neutralized, their ability to fight erased with startling efficiency. The contradiction produced a peculiar restraint. American officers did not rush to conclusions or revise doctrine overnight. After-action reports were written conservatively, their language measured and deliberately cautious. Phrases like unexpected damage and unusual structural failure appeared where bolder claims might have been made. The Navy had learned, often painfully, the danger of mistaking anomaly for advantage. Privately, questions circulated. Why had the damage been so immediate? Why did enemy ships fail internally rather than burn or sink in expected patterns? Why did radar-guided fire seem to amplify results rather than merely improve accuracy? Each question pointed toward an answer no one yet articulated. The gunners themselves remained unconvinced. They had fired as trained, with discipline and routine. There had been no sense of wielding a decisive instrument, only of executing procedure. The idea that something profound had occurred sat uneasily with the ordinariness of their actions. And so, both sides of the battle shared an unlikely condition: confusion. The Japanese searched for a new weapon that did not exist. The Americans dismissed the effects of a weapon they already possessed. Between them lay a gap in understanding wide enough to shape the next phase of the war. Because somewhere in the space between calculation and consequence, something ordinary was behaving extraordinarily, and neither side yet understood why. For years, Japanese destroyer doctrine had been built on a quiet certainty. Gunfire was survivable. Shells damaged. They burned. They wounded. But they did not decide battles quickly. Victory at night belonged to torpedoes, delivered from beyond visibility, striking before the enemy understood the geometry of the encounter. Guns were an accessory. Speed was protection. Darkness was advantage. That belief had shaped everything. Ship design favored lightness over armor. Training emphasized aggression and closing distance. Crews were taught to accept gunfire as a cost of maneuver, something to endure briefly before delivering the decisive blow. It was a system refined through exercises, reinforced by early victories, and rarely questioned. Now, in the wake of unexplained losses, that certainty began to weaken. After first contact, ships no longer pressed forward automatically. Commanders hesitated not long enough to issue formal orders, but long enough to break rhythm. Night battles relied on momentum, on relentless advance. Hesitation disrupted timing, and timing was everything. The pause was subtle, but it was noticed. Formations began to loosen. Destroyers spread out, increasing distance between ships, violating carefully rehearsed patterns meant to concentrate torpedo fire. This was not a conscious doctrinal shift. It was instinct, an attempt to reduce shared vulnerability to a threat that could not yet be defined. In doing so, they traded coordinated power for individual survival. Commanders delayed attacks, waiting for clarity. They asked for confirmation of enemy positions, for damage assessments, for explanations that might restore confidence. None arrived. Radio silence, confusion, and incomplete reports replaced the crisp certainty that doctrine demanded. The longer they waited, the more the initiative slipped away. What unsettled them most was not loss, but unpredictability. War tolerated danger when its rules were understood. This was different. Ships were failing in ways planners had not modeled. Speed, once considered an advantage, now seemed to offer no protection. Darkness, once a shield, concealed something that struck without warning. Officers did not speak openly about fear. The Imperial Japanese Navy prized composure and discipline, and neither allowed space for such language. Instead, fear entered indirectly through caution, through revised maneuvering, through questions that would have seemed unthinkable weeks earlier. Was closing distance still wise? Was first contact still an advantage? Could gunfire now be decisive? Doctrine did not collapse in a single moment. It eroded. Confidence faded not because of defeat, but because explanation failed to keep pace with experience. Each unexplained loss widened the gap between belief and reality, and in that gap, hesitation grew. Some commanders attempted to restore order through stricter adherence to procedure. Others adapted quietly, altering tactics without recording the changes. Both approaches acknowledged the same truth. The old assumptions no longer felt safe. What had once been automatic now required justification. Across the fleet, night engagements lost their former certainty. The darkness no longer felt owned. It felt shared and increasingly hostile. Japanese destroyers still possessed speed, skill, and courage. But confidence, once absolute, now carried conditions. No enemy announcement forced this shift. No new weapon was identified. There was only the steady accumulation of moments where expectation failed. And with each failure, the doctrine that had defined Japanese night fighting absorbed another fracture. Fear did not arrive as panic. It arrived as caution. And through that narrow opening, it began to reshape how battles were fought long before anyone could say exactly why. As more engagements were logged, a pattern emerged defined less by what was present than by what was missing. Japanese lookouts strained their eyes across black water, searching for torpedo wakes, the pale, unmistakable scars that usually announced disaster seconds before impact. Again and again, they found nothing. The sea remained smooth, unmarked, refusing to provide the evidence doctrine depended upon. Equally absent were the signs of magazine detonations. No secondary explosions followed the initial hits. No towering plumes of fire or abrupt disintegration that would have suggested stored ammunition had ignited. Hulls remained largely intact, at least from the outside. Yet inside, ships were failing with unsettling completeness. Power vanished. Compartments collapsed. Crews were overwhelmed before they could react. Armor offered no explanation either. Destroyers were lightly protected by design. But even so, the damage did not resemble penetration. Steel plates were not neatly punched through or peeled back by impact. Instead, they appeared torn, distorted by forces that seemed to expand rather than concentrate. It was as though the ship itself had become the weapon against its crew. What unnerved Japanese analysts most was the direction of destruction. These ships were not being killed from the outside in. They were dying from the inside out. Systems deep within the hull failed first. Compartments distant from the point of entry collapsed almost simultaneously. The logic of survivability hit, contain, recover, no longer applied. Intelligence officers attempted classification, because classification was control. Was this a new shell type? A delayed action torpedo? A novel fuse? Each hypothesis was tested against the evidence and quietly discarded. No recovered fragments suggested an unfamiliar design. No intercepted communications hinted at a breakthrough. The enemy appeared to be using the same guns, the same calibers, the same ammunition as before. American after-action reports offered no relief. They were meticulous, thorough, and almost aggressively unhelpful. Shell expenditure was logged. Hit percentages were calculated. Fuse settings were recorded as standard. No report claimed unusual effectiveness. No officer credited a particular round or method. From the American perspective, nothing exceptional had occurred. This absence of clarity deepened the unease. Wars were fought with weapons that could be named, measured, and countered. This one resisted all three. Japanese planners could not devise defenses against a threat they could not describe. Armor could not be thickened against an unknown mechanism. Tactics could not be refined against effects that defied explanation. The uncertainty began to spread beyond technical circles. Commanders at sea adjusted behavior instinctively, while staff officers ashore searched for answers that never quite formed. Every unexplained loss widened the sense that something fundamental was being missed, not a secret weapon, but a misunderstanding of an existing one. Ironically, the very ordinariness of the American arsenal worked against recognition. Because nothing new had been introduced, nothing obvious demanded attention. The weapon hid in plain sight, wrapped in familiarity. Its effects were dramatic, but its appearance was not. By now, both sides were trapped by their assumptions. The Japanese searched for innovation where there was none. The Americans overlooked lethality because it contradicted expectation. Between these perspectives, the mystery did not shrink. It grew. And so the war at night entered a strange phase, where ships maneuvered, fired, and died under the influence of a force no one could yet name. The absence of a signature did not make the weapon weaker. It made it harder to confront, because the most dangerous tools in war are often not those that announce themselves, but those whose power remains invisible until belief finally gives way to evidence. In the aftermath of the engagements, survivors were questioned individually, separated from one another, encouraged to speak freely, without influence or expectation. What emerged from these accounts was not clarity, but repetition. Men from different ships, different battles, and different crews described the same sensation, using language shaped by instinct rather than doctrine. They did not speak first of shrapnel. They spoke of pressure. The moment of impact, they said, felt less like a strike and more like a sudden compression of space. Air itself seemed to turn solid. Ears burst. Chests tightened. Men were thrown against bulkheads, not by fragments, but by force. The ship did not shudder in the familiar rhythm of gunfire damage. It convulsed, briefly and violently, as though something had detonated inside its own skeleton. Steel fragments followed, but not in the expected patterns. Survivors described shards arriving from every direction at once, from walls, ceilings, decks. Pieces of the ship itself became projectiles, accelerated by a force that appeared to radiate outward rather than forward. Men learned too late that distance from the point of entry offered no protection. Compartments collapsed with terrifying speed. Doors jammed before they could be sealed. Ladders twisted. Bulkheads folded inward and outward simultaneously, defying intuition. Alarms, when they sounded at all, were cut short, wires severed, power lost. The sequence of damage moved faster than procedure allowed, leaving no time for response. Fire, too, behaved strangely. Flames appeared in spaces where no explosion had occurred, where fuel lines remained intact and electrical systems had not yet failed. Survivors spoke of sudden heat, of air igniting without warning. Some fires burned briefly and then died, as if starved of oxygen by the same pressure that had birthed them. Others spread unpredictably, ignoring the boundaries sailors trusted to contain them. Again and again, the same phrase appeared in testimony. It felt internal, not a blow from outside, not an intrusion, but a betrayal from within. The ship seemed to turn against itself. What had been shelter became hazard. What had been structure became shrapnel. Survivors struggled to reconcile this feeling with their understanding of naval combat. These accounts were not isolated. As reports accumulated, the similarities became impossible to ignore. Different hulls, different calibers, different nights. Yet the descriptions aligned with unsettling precision. Pressure, multi-directional fragmentation, rapid collapse, fire without flame. Each story reinforced the last, not through exaggeration, but through consistency. Analysts marked the repetitions carefully. Patterns, after all, were the beginning of understanding. But meaning remained elusive. The accounts described effects, not causes. They revealed what happened inside the ship, but not why. Engineers could model forces. Doctors could classify wounds. But neither could yet explain the mechanism that tied these experiences together. For the men who survived, the lack of explanation deepened the unease. They had faced torpedoes before. They had endured bombardment. Those dangers had shapes and sounds and warnings. This did not. It arrived without ceremony and rewrote the interior of the ship in seconds. Survival felt arbitrary, less a matter of skill than of position and chance. As testimonies were filed and archived, a quiet consensus formed, not of understanding, but of recognition. Whatever was happening, it was not random. The same invisible hand was reaching into ship after ship, producing the same results with unnerving reliability. A pattern had emerged, but until its meaning could be named, it offered no comfort, only the certainty that something fundamental was being missed, and that the ship still at sea remained vulnerable to a force they could feel but not yet comprehend. In Tokyo and at forward naval bases across the Pacific, Japanese analysts focused their attention where doctrine told them to look: at the gun. If ships were failing so completely, then logic demanded a new caliber, a heavier shell, or a novel delivery system. Tables of enemy armaments were reviewed again and again, searching for an anomaly that would explain the results. None appeared. The American guns were familiar, their specifications unremarkable. Nothing on paper justified what was happening at sea. This absence only sharpened frustration. If the weapon could not be found, then perhaps it had not yet been identified. Intelligence officers speculated about prototypes rushed into service, about experimental ammunition used sparingly to avoid detection. Yet, no intercepted traffic supported these theories. No captured fragments revealed innovation. The search for a new gun yielded nothing but the limits of expectation. Across the ocean, American engineers were conducting a quieter review. There was no sense of urgency, no alarm. The Navy did not believe it had stumbled upon a decisive advantage. But anomalies, however unwelcome, demanded attention. Shell performance data from recent engagements was compiled and compared against long-established norms. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Muzzle velocities were consistent. Impact angles fell within expected ranges. Penetration figures matched predictions. But as reports were reread slowly, carefully, some engineers noticed a detail that had long been considered unimportant. The shell was not merely striking its target, it was behaving differently after it entered. Test reports from years earlier were pulled from archives. These documents had once been routine technical evaluations conducted during peacetime, filed, and forgotten. They described blast behavior inside enclosed steel structures, noting pressure effects that exceeded initial expectations. At the time, the observations had not seemed operationally significant. War, after all, was thought to be decided by penetration and explosive mass. Now, those old notes felt less theoretical. Engineers began shifting their attention away from armor thickness and entry points. Instead, they examined what happened inside a ship once the shell had done its basic work. They traced fragment paths, mapped pressure dispersion, and compared enclosed space effects against open-air tests. Patterns began to surface, not dramatic, but persistent. The shell did not need to penetrate deeply. It needed only to enter. Once inside, the environment changed everything. Steel compartments reflected blast waves instead of dissipating them. Thin bulkheads fragmented efficiently, multiplying lethal debris. Enclosed spaces trapped pressure long enough to magnify its effects. None of this required a new explosive or a heavier shell. It required only the right conditions, and those conditions existed inside every destroyer. This realization did not arrive as revelation. It crept in, resisted by habit and assumption. Engineers had been trained to think in terms of armor defeat, not internal amplification. They had measured success by penetration tables, not by what followed. Now, reluctantly, they began to ask a different question. Not what hit the ship, but what happened after it did. That shift marked the beginning of struggle, not just technical but intellectual. It required abandoning comfortable models of combat and accepting that lethality could arise from interaction, not innovation. The weapon had not changed. Understanding had. Still, no one yet named the mechanism with confidence. The idea remained incomplete, fragile, and untested against the full weight of evidence. But the direction had changed. Attention moved inward, into the spaces sailors trusted for protection. And as engineers followed that path, they edged closer to an explanation that would force both navies to confront a truth hiding in plain steel, one that had been waiting quietly for war to reveal it. Engineers began by turning the ship inward. Destroyer interiors were mapped compartment by compartment, not as abstract blueprints but as lived spaces, corridors, messes, engine rooms, ammunition lockers, each one measured for how force might move once it entered. What they found resisted intuition. Fragment paths did not radiate cleanly from an impact point. They bent, split, and multiplied, redirected by steel that was never meant to be part of a weapon. Blast patterns told the same story. Instead of dissipating as pressure moved away from the entry, it expanded. Enclosed spaces trapped energy and reflected it, stacking force upon itself in milliseconds. Bulkheads became mirrors for shock. Corners intensified pressure. What should have been a localized event turned systemic almost instantly. Thin steel behaved not as protection, but as an amplifier. Plates shattered into dense clouds of high-velocity fragments, far more numerous than the shell itself could provide. Each compartment added material to the storm. The ship's own structure completed the work the shell began. Ammunition storage made matters worse, not through explosion, but proximity. Shells and charges did not detonate, yet they filled spaces with additional mass, offering more surfaces to fragment and more resistance to reflect pressure. The very efficiency of storage, designed for rapid combat, intensified internal destruction. Slowly, Design philosophy came under suspicion. Speed had demanded lightness. Lightness had required thin steel. Thin steel had turned enclosed spaces into lethal chambers. What had once been celebrated as elegant engineering now appeared complicit in failure. No single flaw was to blame. The destroyer had not been built incorrectly. It had been built perfectly for assumptions that no longer held. As engineers traced the consequences inward, one conclusion grew harder to ignore. Speed, once the guarantor of survival, was beginning to look like a liability. Despite the mounting evidence, no single report identified the shell itself as extraordinary. In logs and summaries, it appeared as it always had, listed by caliber, weight, and lot number, filed under standard issue. There were no annotations in the margins, no red ink, no exclamation points. On paper, nothing distinguished it from the thousands of rounds expended routinely across the Pacific. This ordinariness became its greatest disguise. Analysts searched for anomalies in design or composition and found none. The shell met specifications written years earlier, approved through familiar channels, and manufactured without fanfare. It had passed inspections, exercises, and peacetime trials without incident. Nothing in its record suggested it possessed the capacity to alter battles so abruptly. No changes had been ordered before the engagements in question. No revised doctrine accompanied its use. Crews loaded it because it was what they had always loaded. Gunners fired it because it was what they had been trained to fire. The chain of causality was uninterrupted, unremarkable, and therefore easy to overlook. The weapon had existed quietly for years, accumulating experience without reputation. Its design had been shaped by incremental decisions about fusing, casing, and reliability, each sensible in isolation. During testing, it had performed as expected, judged against criteria that prioritized safety, consistency, and basic effectiveness. Those criteria never asked what might happen inside a thin-skinned ship struck at the right angle, at the right moment, in the dark. No one imagined it could do this, not because it was poorly understood, but because it was understood within a framework that undervalued aftermath. Naval thinking had long equated lethality with penetration and explosive mass. Effects that unfolded inside enclosed steel spaces, pressure reflection, secondary fragmentation, systemic failure were acknowledged academically but rarely elevated to decisive status. War changed that calculus without warning. Under combat conditions, the shell encountered environments that amplified its strengths and exposed assumptions on both sides. What had been dormant in peacetime became active in battle not through modification, but through context. The shell did not evolve, the circumstances did. Understanding lagged behind destruction. Ships were lost faster than theories could be refined. Each engagement added data, but interpretation required time, and time was scarce. Analysts hesitated to draw conclusions that contradicted established belief. To name the shell as special would have implied that years of doctrine had overlooked something fundamental. And so the mystery persisted. The shell remained anonymous, its role diffused across reports that focused on outcomes rather than causes. It was easier to attribute results to luck, positioning, or cumulative effects than to acknowledge that an everyday instrument had crossed an unseen threshold of lethality. On the Japanese side, this anonymity proved crippling. Without a named threat, there could be no targeted response. Countermeasures require clarity. Doctrine requires definitions. Lacking both, adjustments remained tentative and incomplete. Ships sailed on, vulnerable to a danger they sensed but could not specify. On the American side, the delay bred caution rather than exploitation. Confidence did not surge overnight. The Navy had learned the cost of premature certainty. Better to understate advantage than to build doctrine on coincidence. Yet each new engagement nudged perception closer to an uncomfortable conclusion. The shell did not announce itself. It waited. And, as understanding trailed the wreckage left in its wake, the war continued to supply the evidence that peacetime had never demanded. Some truths require violence to be revealed. And until the shell was finally named not by designation, but by consequence, it would continue to act, silently and effectively, ahead of comprehension. The breakthrough did not come during battle, but after quietly, in the controlled calm of reconstruction, engineers laid evidence side by side, damage diagrams, survivor accounts, fragment recovery, and timing data. For the first time, nothing was considered in isolation. Patterns that had resisted explanation began to align. The key was timing, not range, not caliber, not explosive mass, but when the shell detonated. Analysis revealed that detonation was occurring after entry, not on impact. The fuse delay, designed for reliability rather than effect, allowed the shell to pass through thin exterior plating before exploding. What had once been considered a conservative safety measure became decisive. Inside the hull, the physics changed instantly. The ship itself became the blast chamber. Pressure waves reflected off steel boundaries instead of dispersing into open air. Fragmentation multiplied as internal structures shattered, adding the ship's own material to the explosion. Each compartment fed the next in a chain reaction of force, not fire. The destroyer was betrayed by its own design, light construction, tight compartmentalization, and efficient use of thin steel features meant to enhance speed and combat effectiveness, created an environment where delayed detonation achieved maximum internal damage. No armor scheme had anticipated this interaction, because no one had framed the problem this way before. With that realization, the mystery weapon finally lost its mystery. There was no new shell, no hidden innovation, only an ordinary round, behaving exactly as designed, meeting conditions that transformed reliability into lethality. Understanding arrived not with triumph, but with restraint. The solution was simple, even unsettling in its simplicity, and once seen, it could not be unseen. Because what destroyed the destroyer was not a secret weapon, but a familiar one, finally understood in full. The realization carried consequences that reached far beyond engineering. Japanese planners, reviewing the evidence without illusion, began to understand that speed itself had invited catastrophe. What had once been the fleet's defining advantage, light construction optimized for aggressive night attacks, had created the conditions for internal destruction. The very traits celebrated as modern now appeared dangerously exposed. Armor, long dismissed as unnecessary weight, was reconsidered too late. Destroyers had been built to endure brief gunfire on the way to decisive torpedo launches, not to survive shells that turned their interiors into blast chambers. That assumption no longer held. Protection was not absent by accident. It had been rejected by philosophy. Night fighting, once considered a guarantee of control, lost its certainty. Darkness could no longer be relied upon to neutralize enemy guns. Radar and disciplined fire had erased the sanctuary of invisibility. What had been a domain of mastery became contested, then hostile. On the American side, the reassessment was equally swift, but quieter. Gunfire was no longer viewed as merely suppressive. Reports were reread with new understanding. Training discussions shifted tone. No public declaration marked the change, but expectations adjusted almost immediately. Confidence moved without ceremony. There were no celebrations, no proclamations of superiority, just a subtle transfer of belief from one navy to the other. Where Japanese commanders hesitated, American commanders pressed with greater assurance, not recklessness, but conviction grounded in explanation. No announcement was made because none was needed. Doctrine rarely collapses in public. It dissolves in practice, replaced by behavior before language can catch up. What remained was reality uncomfortable, undeniable, and irreversible. Belief had met evidence and yielded. And in that quiet exchange, the balance of night warfare shifted, not through innovation, but through understanding. Understanding on the American side arrived without fanfare. Gunnery officers did not announce a breakthrough. They adjusted expectations. What had once been framed as suppressive fire was quietly reclassified as potentially decisive. The shift was subtle but profound. Gunfire was no longer measured only by volume or rate, but by placement. Training followed perception. Crews were taught to think in terms of effect rather than output. Accuracy replaced saturation as the priority. One well-placed hit, delivered under the right conditions, was understood to matter more than a storm of shells scattered across steel. The lesson did not require new manuals. It required attention. Radar-guided fire became central, not because radar was new, but because its implications were finally embraced. The ability to place shells reliably into vital spaces transformed night combat from uncertainty into geometry. The darkness no longer obscured opportunity. It defined it. Destroyers, once seen primarily as escorts and screeners, were reconsidered in their role. With accurate fire and the right ammunition already aboard, they became executioners capable of disabling enemy ships with speed and precision. This was not bravado. It was recognition grounded in evidence. No new shell was built because none was needed. The weapon that changed outcomes had been in service all along, waiting for understanding to catch up with circumstance. Its lethality lay not in innovation, but in application. Recognition arrived only after necessity. Combat had forced the lesson where theory had not. And once learned, it reshaped behavior immediately, not through proclamation, but through practice. Because the most decisive advantage is not the weapon you invent, but the one you finally understand how to use. After understanding solidified, the numbers began to change. Japanese destroyer losses accelerated not in sudden catastrophe, but in steady accumulation. Engagement after engagement produced the same results. Ships struck by accurate gunfire failed quickly and decisively, often without the prolonged resistance planners had once expected. Damage patterns repeated with grim consistency. Internal collapse, rapid system failure, and widespread casualties followed familiar lines. Investigators no longer searched for anomalies. The evidence had become predictable, and predictability in war is rarely kind to the side being studied. Survivability assumptions unraveled across multiple battles. Speed did not prevent destruction. Maneuver did not guarantee escape. Darkness did not protect. The destroyer, once a symbol of agility and night mastery, revealed limits that could not be argued away by courage or experience. Crew casualties rose disproportionately. Men were killed not by sinking alone, but by the violence contained within the hull. Compartments designed for efficiency became traps. Survival depended increasingly on chance rather than skill, eroding morale even among seasoned crews. Design changes were proposed: thicker plating, altered layouts, revised storage, but they came too late to matter. Shipyards could not outrun combat. Steel takes time. War does not wait. On the American side, confidence grew cautiously. There was no sense of invincibility, only confirmation. Engagements reinforced what had been learned. Accurate fire, properly applied, produced reliable results. A single realization about what happened after a shell entered a ship had reshaped outcomes, not through invention, but through understanding. And in war, understanding often arrives only after the price has been paid in steel and lives. History tends to remember war in silhouettes. Aircraft carriers cutting across the horizon, torpedoes racing beneath the surface, battles named, fleets counted, victories framed around the largest machines, and the loudest moments. In that telling, smaller truths are often lost, not because they mattered less, but because they were harder to see. This shell rarely appears in that history. It is mentioned, if at all, as an accounting detail, a line item in gunnery reports, a standard round among thousands fired. No dramatic designation set it apart. No public revelation marked its importance. It passed through the war without acquiring a name equal to its effect. No medal honors the engineers who finalized its fuse settings. No monument records the decisions that shaped its reliability. Museums display the ships it helped destroy, but rarely the quiet instrument that made their destruction so efficient. The shell remains anonymous. Its influence folded into outcomes, attributed to tactics or technology more easily celebrated. And yet, its effects echo across campaigns, in after-action reports, in altered doctrines, in the silent confidence with which night engagements began to tilt one way instead of another. Its legacy is not found in display cases, but in patterns repeated, consistent, and lethal. Power often hides best in plain sight. This shell did not demand attention. It did not announce itself as revolutionary. It waited for conditions to reveal what it already was. When they did, it reshaped battles without ever stepping into the spotlight. War is rarely decided by the tools that draw the eye. More often, it turns on the quiet ones, the instruments whose significance becomes obvious only after belief collapses. Loud wars, it seems, are frequently decided by the most unassuming means. And long after the noise fades, it is those quiet tools that leave the deepest imprint on history. That shell did not introduce new violence to the war at sea. It did not change the nature of conflict or invent a fresh cruelty. What it did was far quieter and far more unforgiving. It exposed assumptions that had gone unchallenged, beliefs carried forward because they had once worked. It punished confidence without hatred. The shell had no intent, no preference, no awareness of doctrine or tradition. It responded only to physics. Steel confined pressure. Thin plating fragmented efficiently. Enclosed spaces multiplied force. The outcome followed inevitably, not maliciously. No genius was required. There was no masterstroke, no sudden leap of imagination. The shell behaved exactly as it had always been designed to behave. What changed was the context in which it was used, and the willingness to see what that context revealed. War did not reward brilliance here. It rewarded attention. Men died because belief lagged behind reality. Ships were built for assumptions that no longer held. Tactics persisted after their foundations had eroded. The delay between evidence and acceptance was measured not in reports, but in lives. War offered no warning. It did not pause to allow doctrine to adjust or understanding to mature. It delivered consequence first, explanation later. By the time the lesson was clear, the price had already been paid. In the darkness, Japanese crews had expected torpedoes, the weapons they knew, the danger they had prepared for. What found them instead was something simpler, familiar, almost mundane, and far more final. They had mastered the night, but the night no longer belonged to belief.